We are back at the 2024 candidates. The action from round 8 has just concluded, but it is time for us to continue the party with a deep dive into one of the games of the day. Today was the long-awaited matchup between Hikaru Nakamura and Fabiano Caruana in round 8 of the candidates. And Fabiano was coming into the game facing a disturbing trend. He had lost the previous 3 games with the black pieces against Hikaru in classical chess format. So facing that trend, he has a pretty good standing in the tournament. So which of those trends are going to prevail? Let's dive in. Hikaru starts with 1e4, as he has done so far this tournament, and in all 3 previous victories against Fabiano. Fabiano responds with the predictable e5, and Hikaru repeats his choice from their game at the 2022 Madrid candidates. One of his keys to success has been to keep Fabiano guessing. He's played the 4-knight Scotch. He's played an Italian and beaten Fabiano with a fried liver. Now he goes back to his roots and plays a Ruy Lopez. Hikaru is the first to deviate from their Madrid game, where he proceeded with short castle. There, Fabiano went into the highly theoretical open Ruy Lopez. Presumably, this is one of the weapons Hikaru was seeking to avoid. So his choice was the relatively more quiet move d3. In recent years, this has essentially become just as principled as short castle. Fabiano responds with the ambitious bishop c5. He likes to put the bishop on this square. He authored a chessable course on the Archangel, so this was an expected choice as well. The game starts out in relatively peaceful terms. Hikaru not showing a ton of ambition in the opening, and yet pursuing a little bit of opening trickery that apparently left Fabiano confused in the early stages of the game. He castles kingside, c3 by Hikaru, as Anish Giri pointed out in the live broadcasts, a clever little finesse, preparing to drop the bishop back to c2 in one fell swoop. And so Fabiano hesitated to play b5 because bishop c2 is a slightly improved version of kind of the normal type of position where the bishop is on b3. Here, white can play d4, and the bishop very nicely protects the pawn on e4. So instead, we saw short castle by Fabiano. Rook e1 is a standard move, and now also a pretty standard knight maneuver around to g6. Knight bd2, knight g6, knight f1. Little copycat action from Hikaru. In the first big moment, Fabiano decides to strike in the center with d6, d5. This is always an ambitious move. It's a move that leads to some pretty wild tactical complications. I don't have time to delve into all of them, but after e takes d5, in the live broadcast, we got pretty excited because Fabiano opened the door to some really cool tactics. He recaptures with the knight. It looks like a blunder, but it's actually based on some sharp calculation. If Hikaru picks up the pawn on e5, Fabiano is able to deliver the strike on f2, and only then, after exposing white's king, he recaptures on e5. If white picks up the knight, the queen delivers the fork to the rook and the king on f6, and black wins the exchange. Of course, Hikaru doesn't have to take the knight, but he didn't like this position. He has shown a preference to play more solidly in this tournament, and so he deviates with the more peaceful but potentially more challenging bishop to b3, attacking the knight, reinforcing the threat of knight takes c5. Fabiano solidifies the knight with c6. Keep an eye on this knight. It's going to become pretty important throughout this game. And Hikaru plays the move d4, opening up the center further and leading to, at first, a largely symmetrical structure. Looks like the game might be heading for a snooze fest, an uneventful draw, but lo and behold, we get some imbalances. Knight f6 by Fabi, opening up some pressure on the knight. Hikaru says, bring it on, h3, and Fabi decides to give up the bishop pair, but in return, he forces Hikaru into an IQP, isolated queen-pawn position. Pawn on d4 is a long-term weakness, and Fabiano has a lovely blockading knight that returns to d5. He can bring the bishop out to e6. A pretty comfortable outcome of the opening for Fabiano Caruana. Now the fun begins in earnest. First, Hikaru drops the bishop back to c2, potentially eyeing that h7 pawn, although that knight on g6 is a beautiful, rock-solid defending piece. Bishop to e6, completing his development. Hikaru completes the maneuver initiated many moves earlier with knight g3, and knight d to f4, an ambitious step forward by Fabiano, but it is coolly rebuffed by the rook lift to e4. Get back there, says Nakamura. The knight returns to d5. It's been a pretty long day. And here, Hikaru in the interview mentioned that he contemplated acquiescing to the repetition with rook e1, but ultimately decides on the gutsy a3, limiting the knight and basically saying, I'm comfortable with my position. I'm going to try to pose some problems. Fabiano responds with rook e8. So far, he is undeterred. Bishop to d2 by Hikaru, completing his development. And at this point, a committal decision by Fabiano to drop his knight back to f6. At first, it seems that this wins a pawn because the rook is unable to remain on the fourth rank. But Hikaru had this prepared, and he defends tactically with bishop g5, pinning the knight to the queen. Fabiano responds with h6, forcing Hikaru to give up his bishop pair. At first, this may seem like a positional victory for black. The bishop is going to establish itself on d5, and you may be forgiven for thinking that black is taking over the advantage. But Hikaru banks everything on his piece activity, and he saw a little bit deeper than these superficial factors. First, he brings the queen up to d2, limiting the mobility of this knight, preparing to seize the e-file by doubling with rook a to e1. Still, the position is within the bounds of equality, but we're rapidly approaching what would become the game-deciding moment. Fabiano offers the queen trade. Hikaru shuts it down with rook to e3. At this point, we left this game thinking that it was going to proceed along normal lines. When we returned almost 20 minutes later, Fabiano still did not make his move. In this position, with 33 minutes on the clock, no increment, and still 15 moves or so to go until the first time control, and the only time control, Fabiano spent 20 of his minutes and played a move that we thought he might play in 2. He played the move knight to f4, leaving himself only 13 minutes in this extremely complicated position. Clearly, he was delving deep into various complications, but it was a pretty unwise decision. And from this point on, Hikaru demonstrates incredible precision, just filigree accuracy as he finds every single accurate move in order to shut Fabiano down and win this game well before the time control. Watch this. Probably a wiser decision would have been the even more natural rook a d8. Maybe Fabiano was afraid of Hikaru grabbing the e-file. Maybe he thought that knight f4 seized the initiative. We will never know. Hikaru starts with h4. Now, this move was foreseen by Fabi, but it is a very important part of the overall winning process. Taking the pawn would be unwise. Rook comes up to e4, forcing the extremely weakening g5. Black doesn't lose the knight, but after rook a e1, there are various threats like knight f5. In the long run, this bishop on c2 will make its presence felt. Definitely not something Fabiano had in mind. Instead, he moves the queen over to d5, threatening checkmate on g2. Now, a lot of people would automatically bring their bishop up to e4, but then the queen would drop back to its initial square, targeting h4. Instead, Hikaru opts for the more clever rook e4, and at this point, Fabiano's shortage of time starts to make its presence felt in earnest. There was the exciting possibility of knight takes g2, and the point being the knight is untouchable because white loses the rook after f5. Hikaru had foreseen this as well. He had prepared a calm move like queen c3 or queen d3, and he correctly concluded that Fabiano was not going to go for a position this complex with a little bit over 10 minutes on his clock. It does turn out that white is better here. The knight on g2 cannot really be salvaged. f5 runs into rook takes e6, and this reveals the point of this mysterious-looking queen move. The bishop slides up to b3, and black loses at the very least a minor piece. White picks up the rook, and then the knight in succession. Instead of this, Fabiano dropped his knight back to g6. This was a good call, but now Hikaru starts piling on the pressure. He brings the rook onto e1, doubling the rooks, immobilizing the bishop. Black's knight drops back to f8, far removed from its former glory. It used to be on d5, sitting pretty. Now it has to occupy this very passive post on f8. Rook to e5, pushing the queen off the blockading post. Here we see the wisdom of the common saying that the knight is a much better blockader than a piece like the queen, which is much easier to attack. It is pushed off the d5 square. This square would remain unoccupied for the rest of the game. And ironically, it's actually white's knight, that's not entirely true, that occupies it with the final move. What an interesting touch. How does that happen? h5 by Hikaru, ignore the question mark. It's a very savvy move that restricts the knight even further, preventing it from rejoining the game via g6. At this point, the position is already very unpleasant. Another inaccuracy by Fabiano, who at this point has only 10 minutes on his clock. He drops the bishop back, conceding control of the e-file, but more importantly, allowing Hikaru's knight to jump into the game via f5. White's pieces are perfectly coordinated. The e-file is under control, and black is borderline losing. And it doesn't take long for Hikaru to drive the point home. Queen f6 by Fabiano runs into queen b4, which sets up the final combination. This is a savage queen deployment by Hikaru. He attacks the b7 pawn. Fabiano had to keep the game alive with bishop to d7, but after queen takes b7, the situation is dire on the board and on the clock. Instead, the final blunder by a panicked Fabiano was b5, allowing Hikaru to demonstrate the beautiful combination. Knight e7 check, and as I promised, the final move of the game is white's knight, replacing its vis-a-vis on d5, opening up the threat of queen takes f8 checkmate. Notice the bishop covering the escape square. And the second threat, of course, is against black's queen. There is no way to defend both the queen and the king. Fabiano was forced to resign. And in this resounding fashion, Hikaru was able to create problems seemingly out of nowhere and drive the point home before the time control, showing how good he is, particularly when he senses any weakness from his opponent. A fourth straight victory over Fabiano Caruana with the white pieces moves Hikaru to +1 in the tournament standings and positions him really, really well going into the final stretch of the tournament. Will Hikaru continue this positive trend? And will Fabiano be able to rebound? Will we hear from him? And will he still challenge the #1 position in the tournament? That remains to be seen. But this, ladies and gentlemen, was Hikaru Nakamura's victory over Fabiano Caruana at the 2024 candidates in the 8th round.